Hi, RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 4 of my Build a Wine Caddy Like This One series. And in this one we're going to get into some joinery. And not just any joinery, dovetail joinery. It's the joinery that all the woodworkers get hot and bothered about. It's the kind of joinery that potential clients mistakenly believe is not only an expression of craftsmanship, it is the only expression of craftsmanship. It's the kind of joint that's overkill for probably 80% of the applications it gets used for. But you know what? It's really pretty and it's really fun to cut by hand and it's really strong. So in this episode I'm going to show you how I like to cut these dovetails by hand using things like dividers and dovetail saws and fret saws and chisels and things like that. So be sure to stick around for that. It should be good fun. Alright, so I've gathered up all the tools that I will be using in this video. Now I'll go over them one by one so you can get a sense of what you might need in order to kind of do this the way that I'm going to be showing you how to do it. So in rough order of when they're going to be used, we'll start with these dividers here. Now because these dovetails are a little bit on the small side, you'll want your dovetail dividers to be a little bit on the small side as well. I believe these are a 4 or 5 inch pair. These are a vintage pair that I got from an old coworker. I freaking love these. It's got a little crescent kind of screw clamp there. Super cool pair of dividers. So you'll need a pair of dividers like that. You'll need a marking knife. This marking knife is by Check Edge and it's really skinny and pointy and fits into those tight spaces that you get between your dovetails. So this is the one that I tend to use for dovetailing, whereas most of the time I use my Vesper Tools marking knife, which is much more robust. So that's by Check Edge. You also want a small square. This one is a 2-inch engineer square that I got for maybe $8, and it's been a workhorse for me for any kind of small scale joinery ever since. So this is great to have. A dovetail marker would be nice to have as well. Not absolutely necessary, but I tend to prefer using dovetail markers rather than just eyeballing my angles, particularly in cases where my dovetails are going to be showing. I want those angles to be nice and consistent. And over the years, I've just kind of gravitated to the 1x6 slope. I find that to be really versatile and applicable to pretty much all of the dovetails that I cut. You also want some kind of marking gauge. This one is a wheel gauge. I tend to prefer wheel gauges. This one's by Veritas and it has a micro adjustable head on it. You also need a dovetail saw. This one's by Bont's Sawworks. This is a custom made dovetail saw that I spent a pretty penny to get, but it matches the kind of relaxed hang angle that I prefer for the odd style that I like to cut my dovetails. And you'll see why I have this custom hang angle saw later on in the video, but suffice it to say this is one of my favorite tools. It costs a ton of money, but you know what? It works fantastic, it fits beautifully, it is beautiful, it works beautiful. So one of my favorite tools. And you also need a fret saw to remove the bulk of your dovetail waste. This one is by New Concepts and it has a wood cutting blade in it. New Concepts makes great fret saws and coping saws. They're very lightweight and well balanced and easy to tension. And wherever possible, I'm going to leave affiliate links for these tools through Amazon. So if you were to purchase any of these tools through those affiliate links, a small percentage of the purchase price goes towards supporting this channel. And that's one way you can kind of help me out if you're getting something out of this. So check that out if you're interested in purchasing any of these tools. If I can find the affiliate link for any of them, I'll put it down there in the description. Another square that is really nice to have, but certainly not necessary, is this one by Sterling Tool Works. This is a little dovetail square, so you can see that the blade is super skinny and will fit in between your pins and your tails. So you can kind of check your sawing and make sure that you're not doing it wrong and adjust accordingly. So I like to kind of stay on top of my sawing with one of these. And it's a double square that comes with a regular blade, and the dovetail blade is kind of an accessory to it. You'll need a chisel for removing the rest of your waste. This one's by Ashley Isles. This is made in Sheffield, England by a family that's been doing it for many years. And these are the Mark II bench chisels. Another chisel I can easily recommend are the PMV11 by Veritas. Those are great too, but something about these just called my name, so that's what I ended up with, and I've been happy with them ever since. These are great. You'll need a mallet in all likelihood. Now, some people like to pare away their dovetail waste with just pressure. I like to tap, tap, tap. So I need a mallet for that, and this one is by Wood is Good, and this is the 12-ounce mallet, and it's a round mallet with kind of a urethane kind of sleeve on it, and it's delivered quite a beating over the years and has very little in the way of battle scars to show for it. This mallet has been fantastic for me, and I couldn't recommend it enough. And then you'll need some means of sawing away the dovetail shoulders. You can use a dovetail saw if you want, although the teeth aren't really filed for cross-cutting and will leave a little bit of a mess. I tend to prefer anything that has cross-cut teeth, like a carcass saw, or what I've been using lately is this razor saw Dozuki. It has a very, very fine cut, and so I'm going to dip my toe into the eastern waters and use a back saw like this for removing those dovetail shoulders. A little bit later on, I'm going to break out the kind of unorthodox work holding that I was alluding to. It's my bench on bench with a Moxon vise on it, and I believe that is equally important to any of the tools here, but these are all the little handheld tools that you will probably need in order to follow along with this. All right, so while I'm filming this, I'd like to apologize in advance for any background noises that you hear. See, I live in a suburban neighborhood, and there tends to be things going on in a suburban neighborhood, like airplanes flying overhead, garbage trucks driving by, and right now it sounds like some effing guy is using a dentist drill or something out there. So if you can hear that, my bad, but there's not much I can do about it. That's just life in a suburban neighborhood. So let's start marking out some dovetails, and before I start to do that, I would like to explain that I am a tails first kind of guy. You can cut your dovetails either way. You can do tails first or pins first, but the thing that makes me want to do tails first, and I've always done it that way, is that I can transfer my tailboard to the pin board quite easily this way. Whereas if I have a pin board that I'm trying to transfer onto a tailboard, I have to balance it on end like this, and then kind of try to reach in there underneath those pin sockets to transfer my dovetail lines, and that's just a pain in the tuchus. So that's not the way I like to do it. I like to do tails first. Before I can lay out those tails with my dividers, I need to put base lines, and I've already put one base line on here. With these sideboards here, this is very straight grained wood. There's no cathedrals here. If there were cathedral grain on these boards, then I would make the bottoms of these boards where the tails are going to go such that those cathedrals were pointing upward when you set the wine caddy down on a table, but that is not the case here. This is all nice and straight grained, so it really doesn't matter which end I pick. What I want to do is take the thickness of the mating board, in this case it's going to be the pin board, right? Come over here, and I like to set the face of my marking gauge down on the edge of the board. Just push down on it, and then push the rod down until it meets the bench top. And I'll tighten that right there like that. And that's how I like to get the thickness off of my mating board. And then I want to come over to my tail boards and put a line all the way around the end of that board where the tails are going to go. And I tend to do a bunch of light passes just to make sure that my line is deep enough to register my chisel into all the way across the face, but I don't really bear down on it really hard. I just want to make that line something that I can feel with the end of a chisel. And then on the ends here, I'm going to be cutting off these tail shoulders, so to speak, later on, and I do want a deep line on my edges for reasons that will get explained later. And go all the way around both sides of the board. And now I'm going to put these in my leg vise and start marking out where the tails are going to go. So here we are over at the leg vise, and I'm actually sitting in front of it. I find this is a convenient time to pop a squat, so to speak, to get take a load off, get off my feet, because in my previous life I worked on a cement floor full-time for many, many years, and I am tired of that. So any chance I get to sit down, I'm going to take advantage of. And I have the board sticking out pretty far for reasons that will make sense later. And I got my dividers handy. And it's important that your dividers have nice, sharp, pointy tips on them that aren't too fat, because we're going to put little divots into the end grain here. And in doing so, we're going to leave marks that are going to need to get cleaned up later. And if those marks are too big and deep, they're going to be harder to clean up. If you are interested in learning how to sharpen a pair of dividers that you have laying around, I think Lost Art Press did a video on that back in the day. If I can find a link to it, I will include it in the description. If you're not comfortable sharpening your dividers, you can actually buy dividers that have pointy tips on them already. So this is actually a pair of dividers used for drafting, I believe. This company is called Alvin. And I forget how I came across these. I just probably bought these at like an office supply store. And these tips are super pointy and very thin and replaceable even. This is an option as well. And if I can find a link to these, I'll put them in the description. They're pretty cheap and they're pretty freaking awesome for doing this kind of work. But I'm using these just because I like them. So what you want to do to lay out your tails is to adjust the width of your dividers until 2 steps gets you about, I don't know, 5-6 mil or maybe 1/4 inch from the end of your board, the opposite edge there. So I'm going to tighten these right here like this and just walk them out. So that's 1, 2, because I want 2 tails. That's pretty close. I think I want just a little bit more off of the end of this board here. So make it just a little bit tighter and try it again. And one way you can kind of line your tip up with the end of your board is just use your finger and feel it out. So it's right on that edge. And then poke in right here. I got 1, 2. That's actually a little fat. I think I overdid it. So I'm gonna go back out. A little bit of a fiddly process at first. And of course, once you have these set, they'll be ready to go for the other tailboard as well. So it's worth it to kind of get this where you want. There we go. That's pretty close to about 5 mil right there. I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and put some divots in here. So I'm gonna line the tip up with the end of the board and put a little divot right there and put a little divot right here. And I don't know if you can see those, but there's one there and there now. And then I'm gonna do the exact same thing from the opposite end of the board. So put a divot there and a divot here. And those are the marks I'm going to line up my dovetail marker with to mark out my tails. And when I do that, I actually use my mechanical pencil, because when you're sawing this, it's not as critical to match your angles perfectly. As long as you're close, things are gonna end up fine. Where it's a little bit more critical is when you're actually cutting your pin board. And in that case, I'm gonna use a marking knife to mark these lines. For this tailboard, I'm just going to register the tip of my mechanical pencil into that little divot, slide my dovetail marker up to it, and put a little line there. And because this is walnut, I'm going over it several times in both directions. And there's the edge of one of my tails. Then I'm going to skip the next divot and go to the one next to it. So there's a divot here and here. And I'm going to put a line there and mark the left side of that tail as well. Then I'm going to go to the one that I skipped and mark the right side of the tail, which I'm sure you can't see from the angle that you're at, but same idea, just the other side of the dovetail marker. And I got my last one right here. Slide that into place and mark it. Now, some people, when they're a little bit paranoid, will mark down the opposite side of the board. I think when you're new to sawing dovetails, it's not the worst idea, because then you can kind of take a peek back there once in a while and see if you're sawing nice and straight and even. But for myself, I've done this enough that I'm pretty comfortable sawing pretty straight. And so I only mark the top and the front of the tail board. So I just leave it like that. And I'll do the exact same thing with the exact same setting on my dividers on the opposite board. Line up dividers at the end, divot, divot, come back the other way, divot, divot, mark them out. This time I'll start from the right side and do the right side tails, right sides of my tails. Skip a divot, come over here, like that. Now we'll do the other side. And skip a divot, come over to this one. And there's my other tailboard, ready to go. So now we've reached the part of the video where I kind of catch my fellow travelers off guard and just take a sudden swerve off the proverbial highway of common practice and just start defiantly and confidently off-roading it through the bushes. So common practice would be to take your tailboards and put them in your leg vise or face vise or whatever vise you got on the front of your bench. Come in here with your saw and you would line up with your line on the back side of the board here. You'd start your cut, level out your saw, matching the angle, and saw down to your baseline. But look what my back is doing right now. And it doesn't like that so much. And as young as I used to be, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. I like to have my eyes nice and close to where I'm sawing here so I can really keep an eye on what I'm doing. And all that requires me to hunch over like an old man until I feel like an old man. What I like to do instead is use this contraption over here. This is called a bench on bench. So a bench on bench like this one should kind of make it apparent why it is I tend to prefer this for cutting my dovetails. When I stand next to it, you can see that it takes my work and puts it up higher under my nose where I can see it better and not have to hunch over quite as much in order to see what it is I'm doing. If you're curious about this design, what the impetus for it was, and what some of its other uses are, I did do a video about that, and I'll try to leave a link to that video in the description. So what I'm going to do here is just clamp them down, and I have a Moxon vise on the front of this, which is like a twin screw kind of deal. I'm going to put my bench lamp in one of my dog holes here, and I can move that wherever I need. I'm pulling in a little bit closer here to see what the benefit of doing it like this is, above and beyond saving your back. The other advantage of getting your workpiece up high like this is you can saw it differently. So when I showed you this workpiece trucked up in my leg vise, when you would saw a tailboard like that, you would typically start with the backside edge of the board. After you started your cut, you would lower your saw until you're cutting across the line on your end grain. And then hopefully you've done that in a way that you're matching the angle of your tail at the same time. And then start cutting down the face of the board until you've hit your baseline, which means you're cutting along one line at a time, and there's plenty of opportunity along the way to kind of have your saw angled not quite right and end up cutting a little bit of a wonky tail. Having my workpiece up higher like this allows me to cut from the front edge of my tail board, and in doing so, I can keep an eye on both the line on my end grain and the line on the face grain and saw to both those lines simultaneously. And I find in doing that, I'm able to cut much more accurately. Because the board is up high, I can do so ergonomically. All I have to do is drop my elbow and just lean forward just a little bit. I'm not hunched over a whole ton. One of the disadvantages of this approach is that when you're reaching your baseline and you're trying to level out your saw, you end up cranking your wrist a little bit. And while I did that for many years with the standard off-the-shelf dovetail saw, this is the main reason I ordered a custom dovetail saw that has a relaxed hang angle on the tote, so it's a little bit more straight up and down, so that when I go to hit my baselines and level out my saw, I don't have to crank my wrist quite as much. That said, I did get some tension in the wrist doing that. And truth be told, I'd much rather deal with a little bit of tension in my wrist at the bottom of each dovetail cut than I would tension in my back for the entirety of my dovetailing operations. So now I'll go ahead and saw some of these tails and show you that action from different angles so you can see both the advantages and disadvantages I just spoke to. So because I'm right-handed, I like to saw down the right side of my tails first and kind of get my sawing mojo going. So I'm going to go ahead and saw this right side of this dovetail on the end here. I'm going to line that up with my thumbnail. Oh, I need to move my light to where I can see that line on the left side of my saw a little bit better. Like that. In position, and I'm watching both lines and cutting to both lines at the same time at this angle. And I'm just cutting down to my baseline on the front side here. This is going to be the show face of my tail, and this is going to be the inside of my tail board, the inside of the wine caddy. So if I accidentally overcut my baseline on the inside of the joint, I really don't care. It's not a show face by any sense of the word. So I'm just cutting down to my baseline on the front side of my board, on the show face. Now I'm zoomed out so you can see how the ergonomics of this are a little bit different from doing it the more common way. I'm still bending over at the waist a little bit, but not nearly as much. If I was cutting down here at the height of my bench, I'd be leaned over about this much, which my back does not like at all. What I'm doing instead is leaning over at the waist just a little bit and resting my offhand on the vise chop and kind of supporting myself that way a little bit as well. Then I just drop my elbow to get the angle that I want in order to saw to both of these lines at the same time. And in doing so, you can see I got lots of room here to kind of tuck my elbow in and swing it with gravity nice and comfortably. That's pretty important as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut the left side of this tail. Like that. And I like to blow on it every once in a while and get the schmutz off there so I can kind of see my line and make sure that I'm still following it. Then as I straighten out, I stand up a little bit more. Again, make sure I'm hitting my baseline on the front side of the piece, and if I overcut my line just a little bit on the back, not the end of the world. Ooh, another quick note on sawing technique before I move on here. So you may have noticed that when I was cutting that side of that tail, that as I got comfortable with the angle that I was cutting being accurate, I was able to use more and more of the length of my saw plate as I went along. And you'll often hear that it's important to use the entirety of the length of your saw when cutting your joinery. And if you can do that and cut accurate joinery simultaneously, then that is great. However, if you had to choose between the two, it should be cutting accurate joinery, not using the entirety of your saw plate. So while I run the risk of incurring the wrath of the internet woodworkers of the world who think not using the entirety of your saw plate is an infraction punishable by death to your reputation as a craftsman, honestly, I don't think I've ever used the last inch or so of this saw plate on any of my saws, actually. And my joinery has always turned out satisfactorily, and so has my furniture. So those people, they can go fuck themselves. They can eat shit and die. And I'm gonna go ahead and keep doing what I'm doing. So, yeah, moving on. So I finished cutting the sides of my tails, and you probably can't see this because it's so minute, but I didn't quite cut to this line on the face here perfectly accurately. It's just a little bit off, and that is not a big deal. As I was saying earlier, when I marked these tails with a pencil instead of a marking knife, when you go to transfer these tails to your pin board, you're transferring that exact angle that you actually cut to that pin board. So as long as you cut the pin board accurately, the joint is going to go together just fine. So this is certainly not the end of the world, not something I would worry too much about unless it's just wonky in this direction. You do want to be square to the face of the board. And here's the part where I like to save a little bit of time and remove the waste between my tails using a fret saw. So this fret saw is by New Concepts, and one of the cool things about this particular design is that these blade holders have little detents where you can change the angle of your blade. And I've always had this fret saw and my coping saw from the same brand such that the blade, when it's horizontal, the frame is at a 45-degree angle. So there's always clearance in there to kind of cut whatever it is I'm cutting when it comes to removing dovetail waste. So what I like to do is just drop that blade in there. Oh, and this is a woodworking blade, not a jeweler's blade. If you're going to use a jeweler's blade to do this, you're going to have a bad time. You're going to be sitting here sawing for hours. So these teeth are much larger than a typical jeweler's blade, and they're a skip tooth design that removes waste more effectively. You're just going to drop that in there. And then while I am moving the saw, I'm turning the saw over. And I'm going to cut as close to that baseline as I dare to without going over the line. And there we go. Now there's just about a millimeter or maybe a millimeter and a half of material to chisel away when I go to remove the rest of the waste. And that is pretty quick to do. After I've removed the waste in between the tails, I like to take it out of here and put it in my leg vise to cut the shoulders of my tails. Just like so. Now remember earlier how I cut the knife line, or with my marking gauge, I cut a gauge line really deep on the edges of my board. This is the reason I did that. So whenever you want to do some precision sawing, you're cutting joinery or whatever, it's nice to be able to make a deep knife line and then remove a wedge of material on the side of the knife line that you want to saw on. And that actually gives a spot in the wood for the saw to register in. That is precisely against the knife line that you made. Come in here with my razor saw in this case, and if you're wondering, this is the razor saw number S295, and it has kind of a hybrid tooth filing on it, and it cuts really smooth and allows me to drop that saw right into that little groove that I cut. You want to be careful that you don't saw into the side of your tail there. So you have to really be careful about that when you're getting close to the bottom of your saw cut. But that's how I like to remove the shoulders of my dovetails, is by using that little trick. Now I'm just using a bench chisel that's a little bit wider than the edge that I'm removing the material from. Like that. And not only am I watching my knife line on the face of the board and trying to cut along that, I'm also watching the reflection in the saw plate and trying to keep the reflection of the board here in line. If it has an angle to it in the reflection, then I'm not sawing straight. So I'm also keeping an eye on that reflection and making sure that its reflection is basically a continuation of what I'm seeing here. Trying to keep that nice and straight. And of course, that is very much easier said than done. There we go. If you're worried about overcutting those shoulders down below your baseline, you can always kind of err on the side of undercutting it and coming in later and chiseling away whatever extra material is there. And that's often the case. Even when you use this trick, it might not cut all the way down to the baseline that you're seeing on the face grain there. That's totally cool. I can come in afterwards and clean it up with a chisel. So if there's any material left there that's kind of getting in the way of the joint fitting together, you can just remove that with the chisel. And you probably can't see that on camera because it's so small, but I can actually see that knife line right there. And I know that's exactly where I want to be with this cut. So I can actually rest the end of my chisel right on the knife line. And then because this chisel's a little bit narrower than the board is, I can remove all the material in between all of these baselines here. And in so doing, I'm basically undercutting that part of the joint, which has little to nothing to do with the strength of the joint. And that way I know there's no material sticking out in the middle here that's going to interfere with the joint fitting together. So to remove that last little bit of material in between my tails, I've taken my workpiece out of the leg vise and come over here to the opposite end of my workbench and put my workpiece above the front right leg. And I don't really need to do that, it's just force of habit. I have a pretty stiff bench top. I can chop pretty much anywhere on it. But if you're doing chopping operations on your bench and you find that your bench top is a little bit flexy, it's a little bit trampoline-y, you can counteract that effect by putting your workpiece over a leg. That way it's supported right down through the floor. That's always going to be the stiffest part of your bench. And then I just clamped it down with an F-style clamp. And if you want to protect your workbench top, if you're kind of new to this and you're worried you're going to blow through there and jab your chisel right into the workbench top, well, just put a piece of scrap between your workpiece and the bench top. No harm in that. But I'm getting to the point where I'm pretty comfortable not doing that so much. So I've taken a seat on my shop stool and I got my knees on either side of this leg here. It's a really comfortable place from which to do all of my removal of waste in between my tails. And I've marked the inside face. So I always start from the inside face of my tailboards when I'm removing waste. That's just a good habit to be in. And I've marked this with a number 1 with a nice blunt pencil here so I can remember that that's the inside face of the first board. I got a 1/4-inch chisel. I've touched up the end of the blade, and I just want to take little bits of material off, chopping about halfway through the thickness of the board until I've gotten as close to my wheel gauge line as possible, as close as I'm comfortable taking off. And you can see I'm just chopping about halfway through there. And this takes almost no pressure whatsoever, just really light taps. And now I'm to the point where I can drop the blade of my chisel right into that gauge line. I've left almost nothing there. So I've almost overdone it a little bit here. And I'm leaning my chisel this way a little bit. I'm exaggerating, but I'm leaning it this direction a little bit to kind of make sure that I'm undercutting that joint a little bit. Again, the end grain part of the dovetail does very little, if anything, to contribute to the strength of the joint. So you may as well just get it out of the way, because if you have any humps here on the end grain, That'll prevent your dovetail from going together tightly and will make it look a little bit gappy. Like that. So I've only cut about halfway through, so what I want to do is flip it over. And this is going to be the show face later on. Same deal. But being aware that at some point it's going to give way and pop that little bit of waste off. And of course you want to be cognizant of where the end of your chisel is, the side of it, so I'm not chopping into the side of my tail. There we go. Hopefully you can see that okay. I am right on it. Okay, so while I know the Handycam is fun and all, it occurred to me that you probably can't see what I'm doing all that great with my hand right up in the camera. So I put my second workpiece up on my bench on bench, and I put my camera right on top of the bench, which means every time I hit this chisel with the mallet, I'm going to cause something that appears to be an earthquake. Trust me, it's not an earthquake. When I was talking about removing the waste and little nibbles, there's a reason for doing that that has to do with the geometry of a typical bench chisel. Now, in my case, I don't really need to do that because I've cut so close to my baseline with my fret saw, there's very little material left there to remove. And I can easily remove that without causing any trouble. But if you're cutting pretty far away from your baseline, just to stay on the safe side, it's good to take those little nibbles. And I'll explain that in a moment. But the other thing I wanted to show you is this undercutting of the inside of the joint. Now you can see that I'm actually angling my chisel in to the joint a little bit from the baseline and cutting about halfway through the thickness of the board. All right, now I'm working in from the show face. And at the very end, I'm kind of moving my chisel back again to kind of pop that loose. Tight to the baseline right there, nice and clean. Some of you may be wondering why I keep saying that. If there's a lot of waste material to remove, you should take little nibbles as you're removing that waste. Whereas if there is only a little bit of material to remove, then you can just drop your chisel right into your baseline and remove it in its entirety. And this is why. And it has to do with blade geometry. So this little diagram I drew here basically represents the side view of your chisel. So there's the back of your chisel, and there's the bevel, and there's the tip of the blade. And you see here I have some dotted lines that are a continuation of the back of the chisel and the bevel of the chisel, respectively. And then I have another solid line in between them, and this will explain that. So if you were to drive your chisel directly into the face of a big long board, and all this waste on this side, say this is your keeper side and this is your waste side, this waste has a lot of support behind it. And so what happens is as you drive your chisel into the face of that board, even if you're holding your chisel perfectly vertical, the bevel of the chisel is going to create a wedging action. It's going to drive your chisel not straight through the board, but in this direction. That's what this solid line here is. It's some bisection of these two lines between the back of the chisel and the bevel. And so you can see how that can get you into trouble. If you have a lot of waste to remove on your dovetails and you try to remove it all at once, what's just as liable to happen as removing that waste is you're going to push your baseline back. And when you drive your dovetails together, you're going to have gappy baselines. Ask me how I know. When you are removing a lot of waste, you want to take little bits at a time until you get to where your baseline is, and then remove just a little bit of waste at the very end. Because when you drop your chisel right into the baseline and there's only a tiny bit of waste to remove, well, the wedging action of the bevel of the chisel is just going to push all this waste out of the way. There's nothing supporting it here. It's just dead air. So your chisel is more likely to travel in the direction that you have it pointed, which in this little diagram is vertical. Because all that little waste has no support, it'll just move out of the way. When there's a lot of support for that waste, then your chisel is going to move and deflect. Hope that all makes sense. Needless to say, these principles are important to keep in mind whenever you're cutting joinery using your chisels, because you don't want to push your baselines back and create a sloppy joint that way. You always want to remove a little bit of waste at a time as opposed to trying to bite off more than you can chew, so to speak. Now I have two tailboards, and I want to take a look at them and make sure that they turned out okay before I go ahead and transfer these to my pin board right here. So I'm going to get out my little dovetail square, and with my little dovetail square I'm checking for two things. One of the things I'm checking for is to make sure that my baselines don't have any projections that prevent the joint from fitting all the way down against the baseline. So what I'm doing is putting my square stock against the inside face of my tailboard, because what's important is not so much that the inside baseline be in the right spot, but that the outside baseline be in the right spot. So I'm going to put my stock against the inside face of the joint and look under here and see if the square fits tight to the baselines. If it doesn't, like this one here, yeah, I can rock it a little bit and see. So there's a high spot in the end grain between these two tails that I'm going to want to get in there with a chisel and pare down. So despite my best efforts to kind of undercut that when I was chiseling it out, there's a high spot there. I'm going to check my other tailboard and again look at the inside face, see how we're doing here. There's some waste down there right in the corner of the tail that's preventing this from fitting all the way in there. So I have to clean that up. Same deal here, just a little bit of waste right down in that corner there. So I have to clean up the corners on this second board, and on the first board I have to clean up the baseline. Another thing I want to look at is when you cut your tails, as you will recall, it doesn't matter too much what angle you ultimately end up sawing your tails at. That's not so vital, but what is vital is that your sawing is square in this direction, okay? So what I like to do, again, putting the stock against the inside face, is to look at whether or not the outer corner of my tails is higher than the inside corner, or at least dead square, right? And looks like my sawing is on point this time. Let's see how we're looking here. And I'll try to put a picture of this up on screen so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It either needs to be dead square, or if you're going to err on either side of dead square, have the inside of your tails be a little bit narrower than the outside of your tails. When I pair the baselines in between the tails, I like to always face the face side of the board towards myself. That way when I'm pairing it, if I accidentally push through, I'm just going to finish pairing this really quick. If I accidentally push through too hard and break off the back side of that baseline, that's going to be the inside of the joint where it's not really going to be seen later. So that's why I like to always face the outside of the joint towards myself to avoid that potential pitfall a little bit better. But of course with practice you get better at chiseling stuff without losing control and blowing out the back side of that baseline. I'm just kind of hollowing out, cleaning up the inside corners of these as well. All that schmutz can really prevent the joint from coming together as tightly as you would like it. Okay, so here's that all-important moment where you're transferring your tails to your pen board, like so. And the reason it's so important is because it's fraught with peril. Say you're just sawing your dovetails and you screw up one side of the tail or the other. That's not such a big deal. You can kind of pair it to fix it a little bit. The joint is still liable to go together okay. But if you mess up when you're aligning these boards to transfer the markings from one to the other, you've just screwed up that entire joint. None of it's going to go together so great. So it behooves you to take your time and just do the best job that you can. This sideboard is actually narrower than the bottom of the wine caddy by exactly an inch. So I want to put some markings on the end of this bottom here, about a ½ inch in from each side, so I can better align my tailboard to the center of my pin board. So I'm just going to use my little T-square here, ½ inch in from each end. And you probably can't see that, but I can. So what I want to do, because both of my sides are the same thickness, I can use the side that I'm not transferring the tails from as kind of a gauge from which to project my bottom piece out. And I want to make it nice and even with this. So I'm going to feel the top of that until it's nice and flush. Tighten that. I'm going to turn that sideways and then take my tailboard, make sure I have the inside face facing the pin board. Then I'm going to line it up with those pencil marks that I just put down that you probably can't see. Make sure it feels flush to the front. Just like that. Now there are multiple ways you can go about doing this. You'll see people go so far as to cut a rabbet on the back of this. I've actually done that where you make a rabbet right down to that baseline, and then it has a physical thing to register against when you're lining this up. I find that to be a little bit more trouble than it's worth, honestly, so I don't really do that. Another thing you can do is take a piece of blue tape. You can line that up right to the baseline, so you're basically splitting your baseline. That gives you just enough of a lip there that you can slide that into place. That gives you another means of physical registration to line up everything. But if you don't put that tape on there just perfectly, it's all for naught. So I do that once in a while, but honestly, I don't think that's really necessary either. I find that if I just come in here, especially with a wider joint, and just make sure that feels nice and flush to this edge here, then I'm golden. Because the length of these tails is taken as a measurement off of my pin board. So I know that's exact. And your sense of touch is super, super sensitive. There we go. That's where I want to be. So I'm applying pressure with my offhand and just pushing it down onto here to make sure that it does not move when I am marking these tails with my marking knife. I'm just going to tuck the point of that marking knife right back in that corner and drag it out. And I'm going to go over it a couple times because I really want to be able to see that later. Just methodically work your way down from one side of the joint to the other. I've noticed that if I just do one side of the tails and then come back and do the other side of the tails, that I tend to forget one. So now I'm kind of alternating and doing this side and then that side. But however you want to do it, it's all good. You just want to make sure that you don't miss one. Now I have my tails transferred with these knife lines to the end grain. And now I need to mark a baseline based off the thickness of this tailboard and draw vertical lines down from these tail lines to the baseline. Hope that makes sense. Oh, and this is very important too. So this is my number 1 tailboard. I need to make a corresponding mark on this pin board that's not going to get sawed away in a moment. And what I like to do is, see this center pin right here? I'm going to put a mark between that center pin edge there and where the baseline is going to be, and put a little 1 there as well. That will be on the inside of the joint when it gets glued up, but that way I don't have to worry about accidentally sawing away wherever I've put my little 1 as a mark here. And while I milled these to pretty much the same thickness, it's just pretty much the same thickness. It might not be exactly the same thickness. So I'm going to undo my wheel gauge here and take a new measurement to get the thickness of my tailboard, and then transfer it to the pin board that I just marked. And there's nothing going to get sawed off the shoulders of these. So I really only have to mark the faces of each side, like that. And I like to transfer these lines over to the face grain here, and those all have to be vertical lines. So I'm just going to come in here and register my marking knife right into that line, bring my square over to it, and mark down here to the baseline. You'll hear people say that you should flip the bevel of your marking knife such that the bevel is always on the waist side of a given cut. That's a whole level of anal retentiveness that I don't really see the need to engage in, because the joints turn out fine either way. This is not such a deep knife line that really matters. The knife line is super narrow. I prefer to just put the bevel on whatever side of the knife is more comfortable to mark the line with. And then I've already traced these on top here, top of the end grain, just to make them easier to see. Not only for you guys who are watching this on a screen somewhere, but for myself. And again, I'm only marking on the end grain and the face grain, not the inside of the joint, because I'm comfortable enough with my sawing. But if you're new to this, it wouldn't be a bad idea to drop those vertical lines down the backside to the baseline as well, just so you can keep an eye on your progress and make sure that you're sawing okay. And whereas it was very important that you saw square to the face like this when you're sawing your tailboards, in this case it's very important that you saw vertically into the end grain from this side. So I hope that all makes sense and will help your joints go together better. Now I'm going to transfer the tails from the other side to the other side of this bottom piece. And it's very, very important that the bottom of your bottom piece remains the bottom of your bottom piece. So when you go to switch this around, you just rotate it like this. You don't flip it end for end. That will result in a wine caddy that doesn't hold wine at all. A note for people that are somewhat new to this is a good idea to mark your waist with a blunt pencil so you can see your lines really good. So you know which part is going to be the waist, so you know which side of each of these knife lines to cut on. Truth be told, I don't do this anymore, because after years of cutting dovetails by hand, I can see a dovetail joint inside and outside and upside down and backwards in my head. And so I just kind of automatically know which part to saw against. But until you're comfortable not messing that up, you'll want to mark your waist so you don't cut on the wrong side of your line and leave a big gap that way. Well, now we're in familiar territory, aren't we? So all we have to do now is saw to the correct side of each of our knife lines, making sure we're staying nice and vertical, removing the bulk of the waist with the fret saw, and then removing the remainder of the waist with chisels, albeit a little bit wider chisels than we were using with the tailboards, and then we'll pick up from there. So at this point, you might be tempted to kind of halfway knock your joint together to see how things are fitting and adjust accordingly, and I would recommend against that. Because if you do that, if your tails fit tight at least, they will compress the sides of your pins. And especially if there's a lot of wiggling going on, those pins will stay compressed when you pull apart the joint again. And when you finally do go to glue it up, they might not expand again to fill the little gaps on either side of the pin that you've created by smashing it all together. So I recommend against doing test fitting of dovetails for that reason. One last thing I like to do before I put my dovetail joints together is to ease the inside corners of my dovetails. Let me show you what I mean by that. So I want to find the inside face of my board, so I have a little mark there for board number 2 and board number 1. So that's the inside faces. And avoiding this outer corner here, I want to take off the inside corner of that dovetail. So that's the inside face. I'm avoiding that outer corner right there, coming in just a little bit from that, and just taking a little sliver off of that, easing the edge, so to speak. Come in here and just knock that off. Okay, so it's time for the moment of truth. At this point, you just got to knock the joint together and hope it doesn't explode. And just take solace in the fact that you've done everything you can to this point to make sure that the joint's going to go together okay. So these are the accoutrements I'm going to use to make this happen. I have a little glue spreader here. This one's from Rockler. It works great. I got a little square just to make sure that the joint stays square after it's been glued up. I got my shop-made dead blow mallet. And then I have some hide glue. I do like hide glue for this as opposed to PVA glue. A hide glue has a tendency to have a long open time, but also be kind of slippery, like snot. So you have a lesser chance of your joint kind of seizing up when it's halfway closed. And then what I like to do is drop some hide glue onto the end grain, like that. Use my glue spreader to take half of that glue and move it to the sides of the pins, like that. So while there is some glue on the end grain, wow, that's just too much glue, isn't it? So while there is some glue on the end grain, I'm not really relying on that for strength. The strength of a dovetail joint really comes from the sides of the pins and the sides of the tails, the long grain to long grain portion of the joint. And I only put it on the pins just to make things easy on myself. And I have a 1 on the back side of this pin, and I have a 1 on the back side of this tail, so that's how I know this all lines up like this. Get started by hand, and give it a little tap, tap, tap together, trying to keep everything as even and perpendicular as possible. And that went together nice and easy. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull it out of here. Get in here with my square and make sure that that joint is square. Just like that. Now, if you have cut your joint pretty accurately, you shouldn't even need to clamp it up at that point. It should just hang out like that until the glue has dried. And the joint itself will be a little bit of a ugly duckling stage at this point, and that's fine. Eventually you'll come back here and kind of clean it up with hand planes or sandpaper or whatever is necessary to clean up the joint. So it will get better looking with time. And then I'll go ahead and let that dry and then glue the other side on. So there's another one of my customary deep dives into that subject. Could this joint have turned out better? Of course it could have. Could it have turned out worse? Oh yeah, for sure. And that reminds me of a thing that gets me sometimes. Somewhere along the way, some people have developed the expectation that their hand-cut joinery should turn out looking machine-made, and if it doesn't, they failed in some way. That is false. Conversely, you also get people who say things like, sorry it looks like that, I made it with hand tools. No, 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 don't apologize. I mean, if the end goal is for your joinery to look machine cut, then cut it by machine. I mean, what are we even doing here? I'll tell you what we're doing here. We're accepting a challenge that we believe adds a certain craft value to the end product and not apologizing for, but leaning into the results. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There's no shame in something you made by hand, ultimately looking like you made it by hand. That's the whole point. So with that ran out of the way, I hope you got some ideas from this video that will help you turn out not quite perfect, but still pretty dang good dovetails in your own shop. And we'll continue on with our line caddy build in the next video. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.